Hi, my friends. So I'm reading this book by an Irishman named John Waters, and the book is called Beyond Consolation: How We Became Too Clever for God and Our Own Good. And it's just a fantastic book. It's incredible from a philosophical perspective. This guy used to write for the Irish Times for, I guess, many years, and just recently have I come across him by listening to a guy on YouTube named Dave Cullen, Cullen, and his channel called Computing Forever, and I actually subscribe to him. I'm a supporter of Dave's on his Subscribe Star channel because I like the work that he's doing in terms of challenging the orthodox. And John does the same thing. It's just in a more verbose, written word, I guess, written, not verbose necessarily, a written way. And it's some of the best writing I've ever read, without question. And it's very philosophical. And so for some of you all who are maybe grandparents, parents, or even maybe youngins thinking about going to school, I would entertain the idea of studying either economics or philosophy, simply because it requires you to think. What I like about economics, the philosophy of it, is there's lots of value there. It's the old economic schools of the old days. Even Karl Marx, Keynes. Yeah, I mean, even the guys from the left, obviously Adam Smith, the Austrians, Ludwig von Mises, Friedrich Hayek, and stuff. These were the philosophical giants of our time before, before the mathematicians of Paul Samuelson came into being, if that makes sense. And just the level of their abilities to challenge the mind by thinking, man, it's incredible. And I just, nowadays economists aren't like that. They're very math focused. Again, I call that physics envy. And it's too bad because when I studied economics and I studied at the Austrian school, it was and I did not want to study econometrics. I had no desire at all to be an actuary type of economist. I love the philosophy of it all. Always have. Always loved the philosophy of thinking people who think. Styx Hexenhammer, that guy, I don't know if he calls himself the atheist. He doesn't believe in God. I don't know if he's more of an agnostic or an atheist. I don't know. But he's a thinker. And his thought process is such that it challenges you to be your own thinker. It's not just, and this is where, again, I said this a million times a Sunday, where Christianity has gone wrong is that the lack of thinking, we just adhere to it by dogma. And, for many years, we were able to get away with that because we were in power. If we wanted to be in power, we had to preach the company line without having to think about it. Well, now that we're out of power, the ascendancy of the thinkers are from the right Christian side, libertarian side, or it could be atheistic for sure, but the thinking side that says the orthodox is such that people just adhere to it because it literally is the orthodox. But the thinking people say, I don't know, man, that doesn't make sense to me. I got to think about this. And that's just where I think education, and I don't know what philosophically or philosophy departments are like in schools. I know sociology is nothing but Marxism, and I guarantee that if you're even considering saying anything positive about Trump, you're going to be running out of that department. History departments, hell, they're nothing but Marxists too. And the crazy thing is there is no Marxist in the real world. There's none. And yet, these people are dominating in college departments. It's insane. And I don't have any I don't care. I think it's odd that the only place in the world that Marxists really exist are college campuses. But I just find it very painful, the fact that they're so dominating that to have an independent thought puts you on the outside looking in. It's crazy. If they can be run by Marxists, they should allow other people, which includes people of faith, Muslims, Jewish, but God forbid, born-again Christians. Anyway, now I don't know if, it's been 25, almost 30 years since I graduated college. No, 25 or so. So I'm not sure, what it's like nowadays. I just know in my economics department is full of thinking people. And I imagine the same thing in the old days of the philosophy departments was the same. I don't know if that's true anymore. I know sociology departments, history departments are not like that, which is too bad. Which is why you should look at like Grove City College, Hillsdale College, these places that are open expressions of free thought, free thinking people. And I guarantee you, if you go to any school that's libertarian or right-leaning, they're going to allow you to have your own thought process. I guarantee it. In fact, I just listened to a Dave Rubin podcast. He's from the left, and where he talks about that. He says, look, going to right-leaning events, I'm always able to have a discussion on things that I disagree with, and all kinds of people disagree with. But you go to left-leaning events, he gets, I can't do it anymore because they literally shriek at me. He goes, it's crazy. There's no open-mindedness on the left anymore. It's all shrieking and triggering. He goes, you go to these right-leaning events, Christian events even, and they're open to your ideas on atheism and agnosticism, whatever it is. All right, but one of the things I want to talk about here about atheism, I was listening to a guy the other day, and it's so easy being atheist in this day and age. And not just from a philosophical or political perspective, but just from a thinking perspective. It's so easy. And this guy, and it's just too bad because I think atheists, generally speaking, are thinkers. Like going back to Six Hexhammer. I think a lot of these guys are. But they had to be because the orthodoxy of, literally up until about 10 years ago was such Christianity that you could not be an atheist without having a mindset that says independent thought. It's gone so quick in the other direction now, I don't think that's true anymore. Let me tell you what I mean. So I think a lot of atheists are just atheists like Christians were in name only. But they don't really know. They just think, that's what the cool kids do. Let me join the atheist thing. Well, anyway, so this guy says, you can't, so a guy, he's using his things about what, how Christians challenge atheism. And he says, one guy on a Christian, some Christians say, prove to me God doesn't exist. All right. And the atheist, as all people do, say, you can't prove a negative. You can't prove a negative. That's not logical. It's a logical fallacy. You can't prove a negative. That's what he's saying. So for me to prove God doesn't exist is not up to me. It's up to you to prove a positive because it's impossible to prove a negative. And I'm sitting there thinking, man, I've heard that so many times. It's by the atheists because it's such a cop-out. You can't prove a negative. I can literally prove a negative right now. You ready? Josh, prove to me you are not in the kitchen. All right? Well, if you look around, this is not my kitchen. I just proved a negative. I proved my negative, obviously with an abundance of evidence that I'm not in the kitchen. And so what the atheists say, well, okay, so you proved a negative, but you actually proved it in a positive way that says I'm not in the kitchen because I'm out here in the, taking Pablo for a walk. Well, I proved I'm not in the kitchen, did I not? So I just proved a negative, right? So inherently that can happen. Now what atheists will say, yes, but that'd be like saying prove Santa Claus doesn't exist. You can't do that because Santa Claus, in theory, could exist, even though he's a made-up person in terms of the way we think about today in modern society. Well, so you can't prove he doesn't exist because he could. Well, the evidence is so overwhelming against Santa Claus existing that we can all say, look, we can prove that Santa Claus doesn't exist just because we know he doesn't exist. I mean, to be a big boy in this modern era means, at some point you got to say, all right, I can't definitively state there is no such thing as a Santa Claus who comes down the chimney with a wink of his, whatever it is, putting his finger up to his nose and jumps down the chimney. I get that. But come on, I mean, this is being silly now. So, we can prove Santa Claus does not exist just by common sense. All right, so prove that God doesn't exist. That's what I say to my atheist. He says, well, I would not be able to do that because I can't prove a negative. You're like, well, okay, so you're saying we can't prove Santa Claus doesn't exist. We can't prove a negative that I'm not in my kitchen. Well, we can, those kind of sorted because we have abundance of evidence to show otherwise that Santa Claus doesn't exist, that you're not in your kitchen. Do we not, though, have an abundance of evidence to show that God exists just by the fact that billions of people follow God, be it, Abrahamic religion or otherwise? Do we not have enough evidence? Now, these people might be stupid. They might be gullible. I don't know. But the facts are we have overwhelming evidence that billions of people who have walked on this earth have had some kind of experience with a God, be it whoever it is. Now, you might say they're fools or whatnot, but that is an awful lot of evidence of people who believe to sit there and say, we cannot prove a negative that God does not exist. Now, you might not like the evidence. Again, you might say the evidence isn't enough to convince you that God exists. That's fine. But for the atheist to turn around and say, prove that God doesn't exist, I can't do it. You have to prove God does exist. I say, no. You don't get off that way. In fact, I'd still argue on the atheist. I said, okay, so what happens when you die? They say, well, you just sit there in eternal nothingness. And I say, prove it. Well, they can't prove it, right? They can't prove it. They have less evidence of that than we have of God existing. That's what's funny to me. It's like they get off. They say, oh, no. You can't have me prove God doesn't exist. You have to prove God does exist. That's okay. And then the first rational is, all right, what happens when you die then? Now, they might say, I don't know, and that's fine. That's absolutely fine. I think a lot of atheists will not say that because they're too cocky. If they say, I don't know, I'd say the same thing. I really don't know. I don't have actual evidence, proof at all. We don't know. We can mutually agree that we do not know what happens. But prove to me that you just die in the grave. They cannot do that. You just lay in your grave. They can't do that. Any more than I can prove God exists. And if I say, okay, so my atheist friend, prove God does not exist, they say, you can't prove a negative. Well, I just proved you can prove a negative. In fact, the whole argument that you can't prove a negative in of itself is a logical fallacy. You're saying, I can't prove a negative, that's logic? Well, that's a negative. That's a negative logic. You can't prove a negative. Well, if you can't prove a negative, what does that say? You can't prove a negative is negative. The fallacy of some of these logical arguments is nuts. And I'm sitting there thinking, so just think this stuff through. What is it with culture that doesn't want to have thinking? It boggles my mind. Just think. Think for yourself a little bit. Say, and sit there in silence. In silence. Because that's when God is speaking to you, when it's quiet out. God says, I got your attention now. I don't even have your attention, but I have your mind and such, no background noise. That's when your best idea is going to hit you, which is God telling you, and what Stephen Pressfield would say, and I'm not sure how he feels in the overall political or religious scheme of things, but he said that's when your muse is talking to you, saying, hey, I'm knocking on your door. I have an idea. Hear me out, listen. But I need you to have quiet so I can talk. I cannot, as a muse, I cannot overcome the noise of modern humanity. I need quiet for you to hear me. And you have to have quiet. What I'd say is God talking. So the atheists say, I can't prove a negative, you got to prove a positive. And I say, okay, well, I can't prove God exists. I need you to prove God doesn't exist. Atheists say, I can't prove a negative. That's okay. So you can't prove a negative. Thus, we can sit here and agree that you can't prove Santa Claus doesn't exist. Well, come on, that's different because the evidence is so overwhelming that Santa Claus does exist. I say, okay. But would you not agree? There's a lot of evidence that said God does exist inherently just by the fact billions of people throughout the world have found God. Not by the knife, not by the gun, but on their own accord. How do you explain that? They could say, I'll tell you, I'll never forget, I had these Jewish clients, nicest people up in Newtown or Newton, I think it's Newtown, Pennsylvania. Nicest people ever. One was a doctor, I think. And I went to the house one time, I was at USA, and the lady, I was telling my story about how Holy Spirit talked to me when Chloe was in the NICU, and the lady was adamant that it was my brain, not playing a trick, but my brain kind of saying, give me a defensive mechanism for my fear and my sadness, as opposed to God. And I said, why do you think that? She doesn't know anymore. I mean, look, I don't know if it's God talking to me. I believe it was. That's my faith. But why? But her initial reaction is like, that doesn't prove God exists. But instead it proves that that's my brain functioning as a defensive mechanism to be able to cope with the sadness and the terror of losing my daughter. I said, well, it might be, but it might be God. You don't know any better than I do. But the facts are we have just overwhelming evidence that so many people have found God. Why would you just discount and say that's your brain giving you a defensive mechanism? It's just weird to me. I don't get it. I don't understand that. And how about, out-of-body experiences? So I'll give you an example. My wife's mom, R.I.P., not a religious person by any stretch. A nice lady, actually, a very nice lady. But she's old school, smoked, spanked, the whole thing. I don't think she ever cussed, but she was a nice lady, but she was old school. She raised 9 kids essentially on her own because her husband died when most of the children were pretty young, on a Kmart, working at Kmart of all places. Anyway, she had an out-of-body experience where literally when she had she had breast cancer and she was getting chemo. I can't remember the whole story, but she literally saw down, saw herself on the bed, saw the doctor, saw the back of his balding head, heard what they were saying, saw what he was wearing, and remembered it when she came to. Look, there's all kinds of speculation what those out-of-body experiences are. The idea, though, you just write that off as not a soul or not your soul above you. I don't know how you can just do that. Because you have no proof what that could possibly be. I have no proof that's your soul, which goes to heaven, any more than you have a proof that. But I mean, how do you explain? Now, look, people take a stab at it, how they can explain it. I mean, I read these books. How do you explain? She saw it with her own eyes. Obviously, she can hear, but she literally saw, looking down at her, what the doc was doing, what he was wearing, the balding of his head, the whole thing. And this is not some freaking Jerry Falwell follower. Let me put it that way. So, I mean, that is an out-of-body experience that just, multitude of people have. You can explain that in all kinds of different mechanisms and manners to say that is not an experience of faith, of God, of a soul. Okay, but I can also say that is the experience of faith of God, of a soul. I mean, you cannot say that any more than I can with any certitude about what that was. But the facts are people have that. And people are inclined to believe, come on, buddy, but come on, that is a soul. To discount that as like the lady said it for me, it's just my dealing mechanism to say, come on, bud. To say it's just a way to deal with my sorrow, as that lady told me, is come on, Pablo. Pablo, come. Pablo, come on, buddy. It just seems to me to be trite. I don't know. So the idea you can't prove a negative, prove God does not exist. You can't expect me to do that. Okay, so you're saying you can't prove Santa Claus doesn't exist because you can't prove a negative. Well, we can. Exactly. You can prove a negative. Prove that I'm not in the kitchen. You can prove a negative. So that right there is a fallacy we're able to abandon right away. Now, people on the right do this too all the time. I don't know what it is. I listen to Rush Limbaugh. He uses that all the time too. You can't prove a negative. I forgot what it was. I like Rush Limbaugh. I'm a big fan of his for many, many years, and I catch him on occasion. I don't listen to it that much anymore just because the unending political engagement stuff, come on, buddy, just bores me. But not just Rush Limbaugh, but just generally speaking, as I get older, I find it's just a waste of my time, my positive energy to get focused so much on politics. Anyway, so my faithful friends, next time an atheist says you can't prove a negative, so just say, so we can't prove Santa Claus doesn't exist. You see how absurd that sounds? No, again, they're going to say all kinds of things. Well, we can prove he doesn't exist by proving that he is a creation of humans. Well, that doesn't prove he doesn't exist, does it? Literally, Santa Claus could exist, could he not? If we can't prove a negative, we can inherently say Santa Claus could exist. We can't prove it that he's not here 100%. You can't, because he could, right? And that's where it gets the silliness of can't prove a negative. Anything could be We could literally be in a video game. I can't prove or not because I can't prove a negative. But at the end of the day, say, okay, the evidence is such that we know we can prove a Santa Claus doesn't exist just by being common sense. I mean, let's not be silly. So if I say prove God does not exist, the atheists say I can't do that. Well, what a cop-out. And if you want, and again, you can always go down the road and say, okay, so what happens when you die? They're going to say one of two things. I don't know. Or you just sit there for the rest of your life, for all eternity, while your worms are eating at your body. Prove it. Because you're saying, okay, if we can't prove a negative, prove that positively happens. What is the evidence of that? And the evidence is minimal relative to the evidence of a supernatural creator. It really is. So I thought I'd share that with you. Again, the philosophical arguments of these things I find to be incredibly enlightening and good for your brain to make you think. Now, again, just going back to atheists, I don't discount atheists the way I discount socialists. Socialists, it's all emotional. If socialism is judged by its promises, capitalism is judged by its results. And the results of capitalism always have somebody holding a wet bag. The results of socialism always has everybody holding a wet bag. But socialism promises no one will hold a wet bag, where capitalism makes no such promises, because capitalism says it's all dependent on the individual with a little bit of luck thrown in, where socialism says we can order society to make sure that no one's holding a wet bag. And capitalism says, no, we can't order society in any regard because it's all individually, the actions of the individual operating his own self-interest millions of times a day. Should I go over here or go over there? That is a choice that socialists can't organize and order. But a capitalist says, look, you can do it. It might not be rational. It might be dangerous. It might be risky. I can't police that up. It's for you to decide. And so when we in the capitalist state say we can't order that, that means some people inherently are going to make decisions that are bad, that are lead to bad things happening. And there's nothing we can do about that. Socialism, on the other hand, says, no, we can protect all that from happening. Well, that's just fanciful. It can't. So socialism is infantile. What's not infantile is atheism. I do think a lot of atheists are actually well-read, philosophical minded. And that's why it's fun to listen to them, because it makes you think. Now, initially it's alluring for some of their arguments. But I find this interesting is what they do, as opposed to good arguments in favor of atheism, they'll take apart the bad arguments in favor of Christianity or religion as a whole, but Christianity in particular. And there's many of them. The bad arguments in favor of Christianity are legion. I'm not going to lie to you. Because we've been ascendant here for so long in authority, we haven't had to tighten up our own arguments, just because if you wanted to be in the polite society, you inherently had to be a Christian in some regard. Well, those days are gone now, which is why I'm pretty optimistic about the state of Christianity. I don't want an established religion just by the order of, everybody else is doing it, so I'm going to do it. Christianity is really built on the concept of a relationship with God, a personal relationship with God, knowing that Jesus died for your sins. I don't know necessarily about Jewish, the monotheist Abrahamic religion of Judaism, but I know Islam is not built on that same foundation. That Allah does not want a personal relationship with you. He wants you to obey His orders. And I know that. So that's one of the differences between Islam and Christianity, is the relationship we have with the Creator. And again, I'm not all that familiar with Judaism to know what that form of a monotheist religion expects of you with their God. I just don't know. But with Christianity, it's a personal relationship with Jesus and God, who loves you and He made you in His image. And so because of that, it's unique. Unfortunately, it's also been, for a couple hundred years now, the dominant force of Western society. And so because of that, we've had a lot of people who just throw in with it for nothing else but just power and mainstream and want to be inside the cool kid tank, but haven't put a thought in it. And I don't think Christianity was ever supposed to be a default. I think it's supposed to be a thoughtful way to find truth And truth is to open your eyes and ears to all aspects, all ideas, and say, I never thought about it like that, which is why listening to atheists on YouTube, on podcasts, reading their stuff is good to do. God would never have you shy away from reading alternative points of view. Never, never. Because alternative points of view will make you stronger in your religion, your allegiance to God. Anyway, that's all I got. Just taking old Pablo for a walk, some philosophical stuff. John Waters. There's a bunch of John Waters out there. Just John Waters Beyond Consolation. I just bought his book, Give Me Back the Old Roads, about Ireland in the old days. And I haven't read that yet, but I'll read that next. Again, I cannot recommend this guy's writing enough. It's insane how good he is. All right, blessings.